The restaurant went completely still. Every fork froze mid-air. Conversations died. Glasses stopped clinking. 40-something people sat suspended in that thick, horrible silence that only happens when something has gone deeply, publicly wrong. A black woman stood at the entrance of Lumiere, one of Chicago's most expensive French restaurants. Linen tablecloths. Candlelight. A sommelier who whispered. The kind of place where a single appetizer cost more than most people's electric bill. She wore a faded gray windbreaker with a small tear at the left shoulder. Her jeans were dark, worn smooth at the knees. Her sneakers were clean but old, the kind of old that no amount of washing could fix. She carried a large tote bag, the reusable kind from a grocery store, hanging heavy from her wrist. She had barely taken 3 steps inside when it happened. Gerald Howard came around the corner fast, a wide ceramic bowl of lobster bisque balanced in both hands. He saw her at the last second. Or maybe he didn't try hard enough to stop. The bowl tilted. The soup, steaming, rust-colored, $38 on the menu, cascaded down the front of her windbreaker in one long, slow pour. It soaked through to her shirt. It pooled on the marble floor around her shoes. The entire dining room watched. Gerald didn't rush to grab napkins. He didn't reach out to steady her. He stood there, looked her up and down the way someone does when they've already decided what they're looking at, and said, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. Asterisk, you really shouldn't be standing in the middle of the floor like that. This isn't a waiting room. Asterisk. Kimberly Land didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She looked at him, calm, straight, unbothered in a way that unsettled the air, and said, quietly. Asterisk, I'd like to speak to the manager, please. Asterisk. Gerald smiled. The kind of smile that isn't one. Asterisk, I am the manager on duty. And honestly, ma'am, I think you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. Asterisk. He had no idea who she was. He had absolutely no idea what he had just done. But I need you to stay with me. Because by the time this story is over, you are going to watch Gerald Howard lose his job, his reputation, and trigger a lawsuit that shook one of the most powerful restaurant groups in the Midwest, all because of one bowl of soup. And Kimberly Land? She never even raised her voice. He had no idea who she was. Gerald Howard stood there in his pressed black manager's shirt, a smug half-smile still sitting on his face, completely unaware that the woman dripping lobster bisque onto Lumiere's imported marble floor was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. But before I tell you who Kimberly Land really is, before I show you exactly how this man's world came apart, piece by piece, in a way that still has people talking, I need you to understand something. This story isn't really about a bowl of soup. It's about what happens when someone decides that the way a person looks tells them everything they need to know about how that person deserves to be treated. It's about the arrogance of assumption. And it's about what occurs when that assumption runs headfirst into the kind of quiet, immovable power that doesn't need to announce itself. Gerald thought he saw a homeless woman wandering into the wrong restaurant. What he actually saw was Kimberly Land, and he had no idea that name was attached to one of the most significant fortunes in the country. He had no idea that her husband, Marcus Land, had built a crypto infrastructure company called Viridian Protocol from a 2-bedroom apartment in Detroit into a firm now valued at $3.2 billion, with institutional backing from 4 of the largest investment funds in North America. He had no idea that Kimberly herself sat on the board of 2 nonprofit organizations, had been named to Chicago Business Magazine's list of most influential philanthropists 3 years running, and had personally funded the construction of a community health clinic on the South Side that now served over 800 families a month. He had no idea that the tote bag she was carrying, the one he'd glanced at with visible contempt, was full of handwritten thank you cards from the children she had spent that morning reading to at a donation event she organized, funded, and showed up to every single month without telling a single reporter or posting a single photo. He saw the windbreaker. He saw the worn sneakers. He saw a woman who, in his estimation, didn't belong in his restaurant. And he made his decision in under 4 seconds. That decision was going to cost him everything. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, from the moment that soup hit her jacket to the morning Gerald's termination letter was processed and the lawsuit that followed it landed on the front page of the Chicago Tribune's business section. I'm going to show you how one woman, standing absolutely still in a puddle of bisque, brought an entire restaurant group to its knees without ever once losing her composure. But here is what I need you to hold on to before we go any further. Kimberly Land didn't come to Lumiere to make a point. She wasn't testing anyone. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She was hungry. She had worked since 6:30 that morning. She had lifted boxes, sorted donations, sat on the floor with children who called her by her first name because she insisted on it, and she had driven herself across the city in a 7-year-old Subaru because that's what she does every single week, not for attention, not for optics, but because that's who she is when nobody's watching. And Gerald Howard looked at all of that, at a woman who had given her entire Saturday morning to people who had nothing, and decided she wasn't good enough to eat in his restaurant. By the end of this story, he's going to wish he'd picked up those napkins. He's going to wish he'd said, asterisk, I'm so sorry, let me get you a table. Asterisk. Because what came next didn't just end Gerald Howard's career. It changed Kimberly Land's life, and the lives of hundreds of people she'd never even met, in ways nobody in that dining room could have predicted. Stay with me. To understand what happened inside Lumiere that afternoon, you need to know who Kimberly Land actually was. Not the version Gerald Howard invented in 4 seconds. The real one. Her name was Kimberly Denise Land. And on any given Tuesday, you might find her stepping out of a black Escalade in front of the Veridian Protocol headquarters in Chicago's West Loop, a sleek, 22-story building whose lobby alone had been featured in 3 architecture magazines. She would walk through the glass doors in a structured blazer, a leather portfolio under her arm, and people, senior people, board-level people, would stand up when she entered the room. Because Kimberly Land was the wife of Marcus Land. And Marcus Land had built something extraordinary. 12 years ago, Marcus was a 29-year-old software engineer in Detroit with $1,400 in his checking account and a thesis about blockchain infrastructure that every venture capitalist in the room had politely ignored. He built anyway. He coded through nights. He pitched to anyone who would sit across from him. He ate ramen for 2 years while Kimberly, then a graduate student in public health, worked double shifts at a hospital administrative office so their rent didn't lapse. They built it together. Veridian Protocol went public 4 years ago. The IPO valued the company at $2.1 billion. Within 18 months, that number had climbed to $3.2 billion. Marcus appeared on the cover of Forbes. He bought a home in Lincoln Park with a private garden and floor-to-ceiling windows that filled every room with morning light. He bought Kimberly the Escalade. He offered her a driver. She declined the driver. Because Kimberly Land had not changed. Not the part that mattered. She still woke up at 6:15 every Saturday morning inside their Lincoln Park home, past the Carrara marble kitchen counters, past the custom bookshelves that lined the hallway, and reached into the back of her closet for the same rotation of worn, comfortable clothes she'd been wearing to volunteer work for years. The gray windbreaker. The soft jeans. The old sneakers she kept because they had good arch support and she was on her feet for hours. Marcus would be at the kitchen island, reading, coffee already made. Asterisk, you're eating today, right? Asterisk. I'll try, she always said. She kissed him on the forehead, grabbed her keys, not to the Escalade, not to the Range Rover they kept for road trips, but to a 7-year-old Subaru Outback with 94,000 miles on it, and she drove herself south across the city to the Meridian Community Learning Center, a non-profit she had co-founded 6 years ago, quietly, without a press release or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. By 7 o'clock she was unloading donated winter coats from the back of the Subaru. By 8:30 she was sitting cross-legged on a gymnasium floor, surrounded by 40 children between the ages of 5 and 10, reading aloud from a stack of picture books she had personally selected, purchased, and wrapped in contact paper the week before so the spines wouldn't crack. One little boy, couldn't have been more than 7, missing his 2 front teeth, had made her a card. Folded construction paper, crayon drawing inside. A woman with curly hair standing in front of a big building with a sun above it. Underneath, in the unsteady, enormous handwriting of a child still learning to grip a pencil. Miss Kim, thank you for the books. Kimberly folded that card carefully and slid it into her tote bag. By 11:30, the reading session was done. The coats were sorted, labeled, and racked. The tables were wiped. The volunteers, most of them college students she mentored individually, by name, by story, were filtering out. A woman named Rochelle, one of the center's coordinators, stopped her at the door. Kim. Go eat something real. You've been here 5 hours. Kimberly looked down at herself. The windbreaker. The worn jeans. A faint smudge of red crayon on her left sleeve from where the 7-year-old had grabbed her arm mid-drawing. I look a mess, she said. Rochelle handed her a napkin for the crayon smudge and pointed toward the door. Your money spends the same. Go. So Kimberly slung her tote bag, heavy with thank you cards and 3 leftover picture books, over her wrist. She got in the Subaru. She drove north toward Lumiere, because it was close, because she was hungry, and because she had absolutely no reason to believe that walking through the front door of a restaurant in her own city, with her own money, on a Saturday afternoon, would require anything more than a table and a menu. She had no idea what was waiting for her inside. To understand why Gerald Howard did what he did, you need to understand who Gerald Howard was when nobody important was watching. Gerald was 34 years old. 6 feet even. The kind of man who kept his hair freshly cut and his shirt perfectly tucked because appearance, in his mind, was the primary currency of a person's worth. He had worked in the Chicago restaurant industry for 9 years, bussing tables, bartending, floor managing, and had landed the manager-on-duty role at Lumiere 14 months ago. It was the best job he'd ever had. And he treated it like a kingdom. He had a particular philosophy about the restaurant. He never wrote it down. Never said it out loud in those exact words. But everyone on staff knew it. Lumiere had a certain kind of customer. And Gerald's job, as he saw it, was to protect that. That meant tailored jackets. Designer handbags. The quiet, moneyed confidence of people who had been eating in places like this their whole lives. Gerald could read a person in seconds, he believed. Posture. Shoes. The way someone held the door. He had built an entire internal ranking system from these details, and he applied it without hesitation, without appeal, and without apology. What it actually was, though Gerald would never have used this word, was a filter. And the filter was not about clothing. He had been written up once, 8 months prior, when a black family celebrating a graduation had complained that they were seated near the kitchen despite the dining room being half empty. The complaint was logged. HR noted it. Gerald received a conversation, not a consequence. He interpreted this as confirmation that he had not been wrong, only unlucky enough to be noticed. So when Kimberly Land walked through the front door of Lumiere that Saturday afternoon, gray windbreaker, worn jeans, grocery tote, crayon smudge on her sleeve, Gerald didn't hesitate. He didn't pause. He didn't extend the basic professional courtesy of a greeting. He made his decision before she had taken 4 steps inside. The soup was already in his hands when he came around the service corridor. He saw her. He had time to stop. Later, in a deposition, he would claim it was an accident, that he simply didn't see her in time. But 3 members of the waitstaff saw his face in the half-second before the bowl tilted. He saw her. And he made a choice. What he did not choose, what he could not have calculated in that moment, because his entire system of reading people had catastrophically failed him, was who was going to walk back in through that door 47 minutes later. Not a homeless woman. Not a charity case. Not someone without options. Gerald Howard had just spilled soup on the wrong person. And the clock had already started. Kimberly stood in the middle of Lumiere's entrance, bisque soaking through her windbreaker, steam still rising faintly from the fabric. The dining room had not recovered. 43 people, couples, business lunches, a table of women celebrating something with champagne, sat completely still. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The sommelier near the back bar had stopped mid-pour. Gerald stood in front of her, arms loose at his sides, waiting for what he clearly expected to happen next. For her to apologize. To shrink. To gather her tote bag and her dignity off the floor and walk back out the door she came in. Kimberly did not move. She looked at Gerald with the particular stillness of someone who has spent years in rooms where people underestimated her and learned, deeply, permanently, that composure was not weakness. It was the most precise weapon available. She said it again, quietly. Asterisk, I'd like to speak to the manager, please. Asterisk. Gerald's jaw tightened. Asterisk, I told you. I am the manager on duty. Asterisk. Asterisk, then I'd like the name of the general manager and the owner of this restaurant. Asterisk. A beat. Something shifted in Gerald's face, not guilt, not yet, but the first faint flicker of a man who has just realized the ground under him might not be as solid as he thought. He gave her neither name. Instead he leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice in the way people do when they want to humiliate someone without witnesses technically hearing the words. Asterisk, ma'am. I think we both know you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. I can have someone call you a cab. Asterisk. That was the moment. Not the soup. Not the first dismissal. That sentence, I can have someone call you a cab, was the sentence that ended Gerald Howard's career. Because a young waitress named Priya Anand, standing 6 feet to his left with a water pitcher in her hand, had been recording on her phone for the past 90 seconds. Hand steady. Expression neutral. She had seen the soup. She had watched Gerald's face before the bowl tilted. And she had made a decision that would change everything. Kimberly reached into her tote bag, past the thank you cards, past the leftover picture books, and pulled out her phone. She dialed one number. Marcus picked up on the second ring. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She described exactly what had happened, exactly where she was, and exactly what had been said to her. There was a pause on the line. Then Marcus Land, whose company was currently in active contract negotiations with the investment group that owned Lumiere's parent hospitality brand, said 4 words. Asterisk, don't leave. I'm coming. Asterisk. The clock, already running, accelerated. Within 11 minutes of that phone call, Marcus Land's personal attorney was on the line with Lumiere's corporate ownership group. Not their PR department. Not their regional manager. Their ownership group. Directly. The attorney's name was Carol Sims. She had litigated civil rights cases for 23 years. She did not raise her voice either. She simply stated what had occurred, who it had occurred to, and what she intended to file by Monday morning if a satisfactory conversation did not happen before the end of the business day. The call lasted 6 minutes. By the time Marcus walked through Lumiere's front door, 47 minutes after Kimberly's phone call, still in his weekend clothes, completely calm, 3 things had already happened. Gerald Howard had been escorted off the floor by the restaurant's general manager, David Cho, who had driven in from his home in Evanston after receiving a call from the ownership group that he later described, in a staff memo, as the most serious conversation of his professional life. Gerald's manager badge had been collected. His shift had been reassigned. He was told to wait in the back office. He waited alone for 2 hours. The second thing that happened was that Priya Anand's video, 62 seconds of footage, steady and clear, was uploaded to social media at 4:17 p.m. By 6 p.m. it had been viewed 340,000 times. By midnight, 2.1 million. By the following Tuesday morning, the number had passed 9 million, and the hashtag attached to it had trended nationally for 4 consecutive days. The third thing that happened was that Marcus Land made a second phone call. This one to the lead partner at Callaway Meridian Capital, the investment fund currently in late-stage negotiations with Viridian Protocol over a $180 million infrastructure deal. Marcus did not threaten. He did not demand. He simply informed the partner of what had occurred at a restaurant their fund had a significant ownership stake in, and said he would understand if they needed time to assess the situation. Callaway Meridian issued a statement distancing themselves from the incident within 18 hours. The $180 million deal was quietly placed on hold. Gerald Howard's termination letter was processed the following morning. The official reason cited was a prior unresolved complaint from 8 months earlier, the black family seated near the kitchen, combined with the conduct captured on video. HR noted both in his file. No restaurant group in Chicago would touch his application for the next 14 months. David Cho issued a public apology on behalf of Lumiere. It was carefully worded. It did not mention Gerald by name. It did not need to. 418,000 search results already did that for them. 7 months later, on a Saturday morning in early spring, Kimberly Land woke up at 6:15. She walked past the Carrara marble countertops. Past the floor-to-ceiling windows where pale gold light was just beginning to spread across the Lincoln Park garden. She reached into the back of her closet and pulled out the gray windbreaker. She had washed it a dozen times since that afternoon. The bisque stain was gone. But just below the left collar, where the soup had soaked deepest, the fabric had faded to a slightly lighter shade of gray, a ghost of what happened, barely visible unless you knew to look. She had sewn a small patch of purple fabric over the tear at the shoulder. Neat, careful stitches. She did it herself. She never replaced the windbreaker. Marcus was at the kitchen island. Same spot. Same stack of reading. Coffee already made. Asterisk eating today. Asterisk. I'll try, she said. Same answer. Same smile. Same kiss on the forehead. She drove the Subaru south across the city. But when she pulled into the Meridian Community Learning Center parking lot, something was different. The building had changed. A new wing stretched from the eastern wall, fresh brick, wide windows, a mural painted across the entrance by 16 high school students from the neighborhood. The mural showed hands of every color reaching upward toward a sun. Underneath, in large painted letters, a line Kimberly had chosen herself. Everyone who walks through this door belongs here. The settlement from the lawsuit against Lumiere's parent hospitality group had finalized 6 weeks earlier. $4.1 million. Every cent had been redirected, not to a personal account, not to a financial portfolio, to the Meridian Community Learning Center. The funds had paid for the new wing, a full-time literacy program, a mental health resource room, and a library stocked with 4,000 books sourced from donations that poured in from across the country after the video went national. Marcus had matched it personally. Viridian Protocol announced a $8 million civil rights legal defense fund covering attorney fees and filing costs for discrimination cases across Illinois and Michigan. Inside the new library, the walls were painted a warm ivory. The shelves were full. Children sat cross-legged on a rust-colored carpet, books open across their laps. The little boy with the missing front teeth ran straight to her the moment she walked in. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the far wall. There, framed in simple dark wood and mounted at a child's eye level, was a piece of folded construction paper, preserved behind glass. A crayon drawing. A woman with curly hair standing in front of a big building. A sun overhead. And underneath, in enormous, careful letters. Miss Kim, thank you for the books. Kimberly stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she knelt down, held that little boy's face in both hands, and said, Asterisk, I see it, baby. I see it. Asterisk. Now I need you to stop for a second. Before you scroll past this. Before you move on to the next thing. I need you to sit with what you just witnessed. Because here is what actually happened inside Lumiere on that Saturday afternoon. A man looked at a woman and made a complete judgment about her value, her worth, her dignity, her right to occupy space in a room, based on the condition of her jacket. He looked at worn sneakers and saw someone who didn't matter. He looked at a grocery tote bag and saw someone he could dismiss without consequence. He was wrong on every count. But here's the part that keeps me up at night. Kimberly Land had resources. She had Marcus. She had Carol Sims on speed dial and a husband whose name carried enough financial weight to stop an $180 million deal in its tracks. She had Priya standing 6 feet away with a steady hand and a phone and the moral clarity to press record. Most people don't have any of that. Most people walk out of that restaurant wet and humiliated and alone. No video. No attorney. No phone call that makes an ownership group rearrange their entire afternoon. Just a woman in a soaked jacket standing on a sidewalk, replaying what just happened, wondering if it was somehow her fault. Those are the people I think about. Those are the people Kimberly was thinking about too, because when the settlement was offered, the first thing she said to Carol Sims was, asterisk, not a single dollar goes into my personal account. Not one. Asterisk. She didn't fight for herself. She fought for every person who gets treated the way she was treated and has no one to make the phone call. So here is what I want to ask you. And I mean this, really think before you answer. If you had been sitting in that dining room. If you had watched Gerald Howard stand in front of a woman dripping with soup and tell her he could call her a cab. If you had seen what Priya saw in that moment, what would you have done? Would you have looked down at your plate and convinced yourself it wasn't your business? Would you have whispered to the person next to you and hoped someone else would step in? Or would you have done what Priya did, pulled out your phone, hit record, and refused to look away? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because I have more stories like this. And they only get more intense from here. But before you go, carry this one thing with you. Dignity doesn't have a dress code. And the most dangerous person in any room is never the one making the most noise. It's the one standing completely still, dripping soup, who already knows exactly what comes next.